Nazis. They're essentially a synonym for evil. And, of course, no one's worse than Hitler. But the Japanese in World War II were every bit as horrific as the Germans, in many ways worse. Their military murdered prisoners for sport, raped hundreds of thousands of women and girls. They froze babies alive in human medical experiments. Yet few people even know the name of the prime minister who took them to war, Hideki Tojo. And his boss, Emperor Hirohito, he ended up going to Disneyland before he died. Imagine Goebbels in the teacups. I'm Ken LaCourte, and the elephant in the room is this. How did Japan escape the blame that Germany got for World War II? I've wondered about it for a long time, and I decided to dig in and see what I could learn. I'll take you through the horror we forgot, what Imperial Japan actually did in the war. Then we'll look at forgive and forget, unless you're a German. Then we'll try to understand the European war popularity, as well as take a look at two specific concepts, nuclear sympathy and Cold War realities, to see how they shaped what we remember and what we never heard about World War II. Let's first take a look at the Pacific theater of World War II, where Japan's war machine killed up to 30 million people, most of them civilians. It includes millions of Chinese civilians, POWs, Korean slaves, whole towns wiped out. But it's not just the numbers that are horrific, it's also what they did to people before they killed them. In 1937, Japanese troops rolled into China's capital and unleashed 6 weeks of sadism that we know as the Rape of Nanking. They held public beheading contests to see who could kill the fastest. Soldiers raped women in front of their families, then carved them open with bayonets. Pregnant mothers were gutted. Infants were thrown in the air and caught on swords. One witness described a girl, no older than 9, raped by more than 20 men in a single night and then impaled with a bamboo spear. Estimates say between 200 and 300,000 people were slaughtered. It was so awful that even Nazis stationed in the city wrote panicked reports back to Berlin begging someone to intervene. I mean, think about that for a moment. And Nanking wasn't even the worst of it. In northeast China, Japan set up a secret facility called Unit 731. It ran from the mid-1930s to the end of the war. Inside, Japanese scientists, they dissected the victims alive with no anesthesia at different points during the disease to study its progression. They removed organs one by one to see how long a body could keep going. One case involved a frostbite experiment on a 3-day-old infant. Another used POWs to test flamethrowers and grenades. People's arms were frozen and shattered with hammers. Some prisoners were tied to stakes while plague bombs full of infected fleas were dropped overhead. And then, hundreds of thousands of people, mainly Chinese, died from the plague bombs developed by that unit. The lab also used Russians, Koreans, and American POWs as test subjects, and virtually none of them survived. On a broader level, the Japanese military essentially industrialized sexual slavery. Around 200,000 women, mostly Korean and Chinese, were kidnapped or tricked into becoming comfort women. They were raped dozens of times a day, beaten, and worse. There's evidence of teenagers with shattered pelvises, girls who died from infection, suicide, or simple exhaustion. One survivor described being forced to service 40 men in 24 hours. And if you were a soldier captured by the Japanese, the outcome wasn't much better. On the Bataan Death March in 1942, Japanese guards bayoneted anyone who stumbled. Thousands died on the road. Those who made it to prison camps faced starvation, disease, beatings, and slave labor. Here's some perspective. The death rate for Allied POWs under Nazi control was about 4%. The death rate in Japanese custody? About 30%. And for Chinese soldiers, there were no POW camps at all because most were executed on the spot. Germany's gas chambers became a symbol of industrial evil, but Japan's crimes were more intimate, physical, even gleeful. And behind all of this brutality was a culture that worshipped death over surrender. In the Pacific, less than 1% of Japanese troops allowed themselves to be captured. They fought to the death or took their own lives because they believed it was better to die than be taken alive. That belief was so deep that in places like Saipan, civilian families, including mothers with their kids in their arms, jumped off of cliffs rather than be captured. They'd been told that the Americans would torture and rape them. We have a first-hand account of some of that torture from Louis Zamperini. He was an Olympic track star who became a bombardier in the Pacific. His plane went down, and he spent 47 days at sea before Japanese forces picked him up and threw him in a prison camp. It was known as Execution Island. He was routinely starved and beaten. A sadistic commander named Watanabe made it his mission to break Zamperini and others. He beat him daily, sometimes punching him unconscious. He starved and humiliated him. One day, he ordered every man in the camp to punch Zamperini in the face, over 200 times. Zamperini was freed at the end of World War II after 2 years in captivity, and his story was turned into a really amazing book called Unbroken. I have a link to that below. It was also turned into a movie directed by Angelina Jolie. And oh, by the way, if the US hadn't ended the war so quickly with atomic bombs, the Japanese had plans to murder every Allied POW in the country. And when it came to Japan, there essentially became a policy of forgive and forget, and most of the war criminals never faced any kind of reckoning. After the war, top Nazi leaders were dragged into court, paraded before the world, hanged. Swastikas and other Nazi symbols are still banned in Germany. And Japan did have some war trials, but that ended up executing 7 people, including Tojo. But by 1958, every other convicted war criminal was set free. And some of the worst offenders were never even tried. Watanabe, the POW commander who tortured Zamperini, he was listed as number 23 on General MacArthur's most wanted criminals list. That list was public, his crimes were known. But he hid out for a few years, then reemerged in Japan as a free man, working in insurance. In 1998, he sat down for an interview where he didn't really feel sorry for anything, and he died at the age of 85 without ever seeing a hint of punishment. That was the pattern with a lot of the perpetrators. Unit 731's leadership was never prosecuted. In 1946, U.S. intelligence struck a secret deal, and the scientists and leaders got full immunity in exchange for their germ warfare research. The data was classified and later used as a foundation for the U.S. bioweapons program. Emperor Hirohito, who presided over all of it, he got a pass as well. General MacArthur said that if the U.S. arrested Hirohito, it would take 1 million troops to keep Japan from exploding. He also worried that the Soviets might fill the vacuum, so Hirohito stayed on the throne, never testifying or standing trial. And as I mentioned, in 1975, he took a goodwill tour to the United States and had a great time at Disneyland. I remember my dad telling me how wrong that felt at the time, especially because he had friends who died in that war. That's my dad on the right, and actually Louis Zamperini on the left, who became his friend later in life. No German leader could have pulled off a U.S. goodwill tour. Germany got never again, and the country spent decades apologizing, educating, and confronting its past. You can't walk through Berlin without stumbling into a memorial. But Japan got a clean slate. And it's not just the Japanese public that moved on. Our memories of Americans and others throughout the world have gotten fuzzy too. Hey, I researched this deeply, but I'm not perfect. If I made a mistake or left something important out, I'll correct it in the description box below. You can also find my source notes there as well. Okay, so what we remember often comes down to who tells the story. After World War II, for the American public, the main characters were in Europe. That was the war we recognized. I mean, the people were more culturally familiar, and the places were more recognizable to us. Also, the Allies made filming Nazi atrocities a top priority. Military photographers shot hours of footage at concentration camps. They showed piles of corpses, mass graves, gas chambers, and the living dead. Survivors told their stories on camera. The Allies recorded the horrors as evidence for war crimes and for our collective memory. But the Pacific Theater was different. It was jungle warfare with enemies that looked nothing like us. Photos and testimony from that time, they exist, but the original film footage is rare, and most of it shows a general aftermath, not the actual atrocities. Asian victims also didn't resonate the same way. Wartime propaganda dehumanized the entire region and race. Orientals was the term used to lump Chinese civilians and Japanese soldiers into one large, blurry category, and it dulled the outrage. Americans didn't see Asians as fellow Westerners under siege. They saw a different battlefield, filled with people they didn't understand and that they just didn't care as much about. For decades, U.S. history books covered Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the atomic bombs in vivid detail. But we got maybe a sentence or two on Japanese aggression, even less about the horrors. Until the late 1990s, most Americans had never heard of Unit 731. When Iris Chang published The Rape of Nanking in 1997, it felt like a shocking exposé because it was. The story had been missing from the syllabus for 50 years. Meanwhile, the Holocaust became a foundation of World War II education. Every American student knows the name Auschwitz and Dachau, but hardly anyone knows Pingfang, the town where Unit 731 operated. Another factor to consider is that most of Hollywood's powerful studio heads were Jewish immigrants, some of them refugees. Telling the story of Nazi evil was personal. So we got dozens of European war movies, Holocaust films, documentaries, and memoirs. Entire genres were built around it. By contrast, Pacific War films were rarer. Movies like Empire of the Sun or Unbroken came decades later, but few had the impact of the European War, and there was certainly never an equivalent Schindler's List. And that leads us to nuclear sympathy, which helped Japan pull off a rare transformation from brutal empire to global victim. In August 1945, the US dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, first on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people died instantly, and tens of thousands more suffered and died from radiation in the weeks that followed. Those bombs didn't just end the war, they rewrote the story of what happened beforehand. The images of charred schoolchildren, shadows of vaporized bodies, and burn victims stumbling through rubble, they were unforgettable. And the country that butchered its way through Asia became seen by many as the first victim of nuclear war. And Japan leaned into that hard. Once the US occupation ended, the Japanese government built a national identity around peace and atomic suffering. Every August, Hiroshima hosts a solemn ceremony with speeches, lanterns, doves. It's treated as a uniquely tragic event in world history, which it is. But it also overshadows what Japan did before 1945. Even visiting diplomats follow the script. They lay wreaths at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, but they rarely acknowledge Japan's horror. And inside Japan, that narrative stuck as well. Surveys show citizens are far more likely to recall the firebombings of Tokyo or the A-bomb attacks than any atrocities they committed. When tough questions come up about Unit 731, Comfort Women, Nanking, Japanese officials often pivot to Hiroshima, and it shifts the conversation from what we did to what was done to us. And as Cold War tensions rose, Japan's anti-nuclear stance, it won at moral points abroad. It became a pacifist model. And over time, Western guilt about the nuclear bombs meant that victories over Europe was celebrated more often than that over Japan. The end result is that the world remembers the ending of the war more clearly than it remembers the beginning and the terrible middle. But right after the war, why weren't more Japanese leaders prosecuted? Why did the emperor and so many others walk away free? It wasn't just niceness. The US was also becoming more strategic during the Cold War. After the surrender, America had to decide what kind of a Japan it wanted to help rebuild. Actually, at first, the US worked to demilitarize and democratize Japan. They held trials, purged generals, and they wrote a new constitution. But by 1947, the priorities had flipped. Communism was spreading fast, and Washington decided Japan was more useful as a stable ally rather than a punished enemy. Historians call it the reverse course. General MacArthur decided to protect the emperor, fast-track economic recovery, and stop arresting new war criminals. By 1948, the US stopped additional prosecutions altogether, and by the early 1950s, most prisoners were paroled. And behind the scenes, the US struck deals that would have been unthinkable in Europe. The Unit 731 scientists got immunity. The general who ran the unit was never punished, and some of his staff went on to become professors, researchers, and respected doctors. As I mentioned, the emperor was shielded, and a 1951 treaty forgave most reparations. A year later, a security pact made Japan a key American ally. Purged war criminals quietly returned to power. Men who'd overseen slave labor and war campaigns now ran ministries and banks. Nobusuke Kishi, once arrested as a Class A war criminal, became Japan's prime minister in 1957. Within a few decades, the world saw Japan as the land of Toyotas and Walkmans as memories faded. Japan's national broadcaster issued textbook guidelines that forbade the phrase, "the rape of Nanking." It was part of a decades-long battle over how the war would be remembered. Japan finally issued an apology in 1993, the Kono Statement, but it's been a political flashpoint ever since. Some Japanese leaders have walked it back, others have tried to erase it. A 2023 poll found that only 4% of Japanese under 30 years old had a correct estimate of the Nanking death toll. America cut deals and helped build a sanitized version of Japan's wartime history. One that was easy to work with and live with, and it worked. And look, it's not about keeping a scoreboard of evil, but there are millions of people who deserve to be remembered. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history in terms of absolute deaths. But as a percentage of humanity who was killed, other wars throughout history were substantially worse. And one thing difficult to see right now is that even with our ongoing wars that seem so awful, and they are, we're living in perhaps the greatest era of peace that humanity has ever seen. This video may open your eyes to get a better, more hopeful understanding of what our world is like. Hey, I hope you got something useful out of this, and if you did, you come back for another one. Thanks for watching.